On a Tuesday morning in August of 1994 at the edge of Elliott Township in Hardin County, Iowa, a 44-year-old land developer named Dale Prentice stood beside a broken excavator and watched his career calculations start to come apart. The machine behind him was a Komatsu PC400. He had financed it 18 months ago at $385,000, and until 11 days ago, he had considered it the finest investment he had ever made. Now it sat at the northwest corner of what was supposed to become Clearwater Meadows, 52 premium residential lots, starting price $240,000 each, with two broken teeth on its bucket and a hydraulic line wrapped in shop rags because the replacement part had not arrived yet from Des Moines. The ground beneath the machine had not moved. Not an inch, not in 11 days of trying. Let me tell you about what was under that ground because that is where the story truly begins. When Dale Prentice had purchased the 400 acres of Elliott Township farmland the previous spring, he had done what every developer in central Iowa was doing in 1994. He had hired a survey crew, pulled the county plat maps, ordered a soil boring report, and written a check. What the survey crew had not found, because nobody had looked for it and the county records gave no reason to look, was a reinforced concrete foundation slab lying 2.5 feet below the surface at the northwest corner of the property. The slab was 40 feet wide and 60 feet long, 14 inches thick, poured sometime in the early 1940s as the base of a grain processing mill that had burned to the ground in 1953 and been bulldozed flat in the weeks after. The county had dutifully recorded the demolition of the structure. Nobody had recorded the foundation. The foundation had simply been buried under 4 inches of topsoil and forgotten the way a lot of things got buried and forgotten in rural Iowa when there was harvest to get in and winter coming on fast and no particular reason to write down what you were leaving behind. Prentice had discovered it on the third day of excavation when his operator tried to cut the first footing trench and the bucket came back up with 2 broken teeth and a sound like a cannon shot that carried across 3 fields. He had brought in a second machine the following morning, then a third. He had rented a hydraulic hammer attachment out of Ames for $4,000 for 3 days and run it until the rental agency asked for it back, and it had accomplished nothing except a fine network of surface cracks that the slab shrugged off like a man shrugging off rain. He had called a structural engineer out of Ames who drove 2 hours west, looked at the rebar pattern visible in one of those surface cracks, and told him with genuine sympathy that whoever had poured this foundation had used a 12-inch grid with number 6 rebar and had done it correctly, which was to say, had done it in the manner of men who built things during the Depression and intended those things to outlast themselves because they didn't know what else to do with what they knew. The slab was not going to break under impact loading. It was going to have to be removed whole or in very large sections, and nothing Prentice currently owned or could rent in Hardin County was going to do that job. $44,000 in delays and equipment repairs later, Dale Prentice was standing in August heat with his site foreman, a 28-year-old from Eldora named Tommy Briggs, trying to decide between 2 bad options. Option 1 was a concrete saw crew out of Des Moines at $28,000 for 3 days of work with uncertain outcome. Option 2 was the growing certainty that his purchase contract with the first 12 buyers was going to breach in October if that foundation wasn't cleared and the road wasn't in and the first phase wasn't ready. The total value of the Clearwater Meadows contracts was $2.2 million. Prentice had borrowed against projected sales to fund the early phases of development. The math did not leave room for another 2 weeks of failure. Tommy had his clipboard out running numbers that didn't get better the longer he ran them when he looked up toward the county road and went quiet. "Mr. Prentice," Tommy said, "there's someone coming." The sound reached them before anything was visible, a mechanical rhythm from the direction of the county road, textured and deliberate unlike anything else on the site. Dale Prentice turned toward it. He shaded his eyes against the morning sun, and then the gate opened and the machine came through and the story that had already been building for 11 days took the turn that would define it. Let me tell you about Earl Gunderson because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened next, and understanding Earl Gunderson takes a little time. Earl was 74 years old in August of 1994. He had farmed the same 280 acres in Elliott Township for 50 years, not because he lacked ambition, but because he understood in a way that took most men a lifetime to learn, and some never learned at all the difference between growing a farm and owning one. He had watched too many of his neighbors grow their farms in the 1970s and lose them in the 1980s to mistake the first thing for the second. Earl Gunderson was interested in owning. His father, Virgil Gunderson, had broken that ground in 1931 during the worst years of the Depression, when a man could buy farmland cheap in Hardin County if he was willing to bet everything he had on his own ability to work it and on the proposition that the land would eventually give back what you put into it. Virgil had made that bet with $72, a borrowed team, and a stubbornness that his neighbors described, depending on how well they knew him, either as courage or as a particular species of Iowa mule-headedness that amounted to the same thing. He had won the bet slowly, the way you win things in farming, one season at a time, one payment at a time, one piece of equipment, nursed through one more year when buying new was not a possibility, and probably wouldn't have been a good idea, even if it had been. Earl's wife Ruth had died in 1989, 5 years before this August morning. She had been a quiet woman with strong opinions about the things that mattered and no opinions at all about the things that didn't, which had suited Earl exactly. She had left behind, among other things, a green thermos she'd bought him at the hardware store in Eldora, sometime in the middle 1970s, dented along the bottom from being knocked off the tractor bender more times than either of them had ever bothered to count, and Earl still filled it every morning before he went out to work. The coffee inside it was never as good as the coffee Ruth had made, and he knew it, and he filled it anyway. Some habits a man keeps not because they are practical, but because they connect him to something he cannot afford to let go of entirely. Earl did not borrow from banks. He had made that decision in 1952 when he watched three neighboring farm families lose their land in the same month, all of them good people, all of them hardworking, all of them caught in the same mechanism. They owed more than the land was suddenly worth. And the bank's patience, which had seemed unlimited during the good years, turned out to have a specific and non-negotiable endpoint. Earl had decided then at 32 years old that he would rather farm less land and own it completely than farm more land and owe it to someone else. In 50 years of farming, he had never once violated that rule. The 280 acres of Elliott Township were his without encumbrance, in a way that the 400 acres Dale Prentice had recently purchased on a construction loan were not. The machine in Earl's barn was an Alice Chalmers HD 7-crawler tractor that Virgil had purchased in 1948 for $1,100, used 2 years old from a dealer in Eldora who had taken it in trade and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. That $1,100 had been the largest single expenditure of Virgil Gunderson's life up to that point, and possibly after it as well. He had stood in front of the crawler the night he brought it home for a long time before he went inside the house, and Earl had been a boy watching from the barn door, old enough to understand that something significant was happening, but not yet old enough to understand what. "Why'd you stand out there so long?" Earl had asked him the next morning at breakfast. Virgil had considered the question with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Because when you spend everything you've got on something," Virgil said, setting down his coffee cup, "you ought to look at it long enough to understand what you've done. You ought to know what you're taking on. Then you go to work." The HD7 was not a glamorous machine. It weighed about 8 tons and made perhaps 40 horsepower at the drawbar, which was not a number that impressed anyone who was used to talking about modern equipment. It ran on diesel fuel with a magneto ignition system that required a man to understand it rather than simply operate. It required him to know which adjustments the magneto needed in cold weather versus hot, which service intervals actually mattered, and which ones could slide a few weeks without consequence, how to read the engine note for the first signs of a problem before the problem became a failure. It had no hydraulics. It had no cab, no air conditioning, no protective enclosure of any kind. It had a steel seat, a throttle, a clutch, and a set of steel tracks that gripped the earth with a patience that purely wheeled machines could not replicate. What it had underneath all of that plain functional appearance was a drawbar pull capacity that few machines its size could match, a low, steady ground level force that did not surge and drop the way hydraulic systems did, but applied itself continuously like a man leaning into a heavy door and simply refusing to stop leaning, holding the load not through bursts of power, but through persistence. Virgil had understood that quality when he bought the machine. He had spent 40 years teaching Earl how to use it. "The ground doesn't lie, Earl," Virgil used to say in those years when Earl was learning. You don't fight it, you listen to it first. You figure out where it wants to move. Then you apply what you've got in the right direction, and you hold it there until the ground is ready. That's all there is to it. That's all there ever was. Earl had listened to a lot of ground in 50 years. He had been listening to the ground at the northwest corner of what was now Clearwater Meadows for 11 days, watching from the cab of his pickup truck, parked at the edge of his own property line, watching Dale Prentice throw expensive equipment at a problem that expensive equipment was not designed to solve. He had watched the hydraulic hammer. He had watched the D8 dozer push while the Komatsu pulled, and both of them accomplished nothing except burning fuel and making noise. He had watched 3 hoses fail and 2 bucket teeth shatter. Let me tell you about what Earl was watching, because he was not just watching failure. He was reading something. On the east edge of the slab, at a point about 14 feet from the northeast corner, the surface cracks from the hammerwork did not run the way they should have run if the slab were monolithic. They ran parallel to each other along a line that was slightly darker than the surrounding concrete, a color difference so subtle that you would miss it entirely if you were looking at the machine doing the work instead of at the material being worked. Earl had seen that kind of line before. It was a construction joint, a seam where 2 separate pores had been joined. Every large concrete pour of that era had them. The rebar crossed the joint, which was why the slab held together under impact loading, but the concrete bond at the joint was different from the bond elsewhere in the slab. Older, less certain. The weakest point in the entire 40-foot width of reinforced concrete if you knew where to look and how to apply force to it in the right way. Nobody had been pulling from that angle. Every machine Prentice had brought had attacked from the top or from the south where the access was easiest. The joint was on the east face close to Earl's property line, in a direction nobody had tried. Earl had decided this morning that he had watched long enough. Now, 3 months earlier, he had driven the HD7 along the property boundary to move some drainage tile, and Prentice had been there with 6 of his workers watching the clearing operation. Prentice had seen Earl on the old crawler and said something loud enough for everyone standing nearby to hear without having to strain. "That antique belonged in the Smithsonian, old man." Prentice had his thumbs in his belt loops and was smiling the smile of a man who expects laughter and usually gets it. "I've got a machine worth more than your whole farm. $250,000 of modern engineering sitting right over Mayram." He nodded toward the Komatsu gleaming and new in the morning light. "You just stay out of the way and watch how it's done. We'll show you what equipment looks like when it was built in this century." The 6 workers had laughed. Earl had looked at Prentice for a moment, then at the Komatsu, then back at Prentice. He had not said anything. He had nodded once, not in agreement, just in acknowledgement that the words had been spoken and heard, and driven the HD7 back toward his barn at the same unhurried pace he drove it everywhere. Now, 3 months later, he drove it back the other way. The sound of the HD7 reached Tommy Briggs before anything else did. It was not the smooth, contained, well-muffled sound of modern diesel equipment. It was older than that, a mechanical rhythm with texture in it, with a particular note of a machine that had been maintained by hand for 46 years and had settled into a relationship with its own operation that you could not buy and could not replicate and could only accumulate through time and attention. Tommy heard it from the county road first as a distant, irregular thrum, then felt it as the crawler came through the gate, a faint vibration moving through the packed gravel of the access road and up through the soles of his work boots into the bones of his feet. Then he saw it, Earl Gunderson sitting straight-backed on the open steel seat of the HD7 with both hands on the controls and no cab around him, and the August sun already full on his face towing a small flatbed trailer loaded with chain, 2 cast-iron pulley blocks, a come-along winch, a collection of steel stakes, and what appeared to be several decades' worth of purpose. Prentice watched the crawler come through his gate with an expression that moved through confusion and irritation and landed somewhere harder to name. "What is that doing on my site?" he said. "That's Earl Gunderson," Tommy said. "He farms the parcel to the north. He's been parked at his property line watching us work for about a week and a half. I don't care how long he's been watching. This is a closed construction site. Insurance liability." Prentice was already moving toward the crawler. "Tell him to turn around." But Earl had already stopped the machine and was climbing down, moving with the deliberate pace of a man whose joints had opinions, but whose will had not consulted them in many years and did not plan to start. He walked toward Prentice without hurrying and without any particular expression on his face. "Morning," Earl said. "This site is closed to the public," Prentice said. "I'm going to have to ask you to take that machine back out the way you came in." Earl looked at the Komatsu with its broken bucket teeth and its wrapped hydraulic line. He looked at the pale gray mass of the slab visible at the edge of the excavated area. His expression did not change. "Looks like you've been having some trouble," Earl said. "We've got it managed." "I've been watching for about 11 days, Earl said. "I don't think you've got it managed." Prentice's face went through several things in quick succession. Tommy, who had worked for him for 3 years and knew his tells, took a small, careful step backward. "What exactly," Prentice said with the particular quiet of a man who is working hard to keep his voice at a professional register, "do you think you are going to do with that?" He pointed at the HD7. "That crawler weighs 8 tons. My Komatsu weighs 40. My Komatsu, my hydraulic hammer, and my D8 dozer together represent $700,000 in modern equipment. None of them moved that slab, not an inch, not in 11 days. You think that thing is going to do what $700,000 in modern machinery couldn't?" Earl looked at him steadily. "Your machines have been fighting the concrete," he said. "I'm not going to fight it." "Then what are you going to do?" "Find the angle it wants to move." Earl turned toward the slab. "I'll need to look at it for a while first. Let me tell you about what Earl saw when he examined that slab, because that is where the technical part of this story becomes worth understanding. The foundation was 1940s construction, the kind poured by men who had learned their craft during the Depression years and built things to outlast themselves, because outlasting yourself was the only form of permanence available to people without money. The rebar grid was 12-inch spacing number 6 bar, which meant the steel was 3/4 of an inch thick and tied at every intersection with wire that had been hand-twisted 40,000 times by men who were paid by the day and took their time. The concrete itself was a high-lime mix that was stronger in compression than modern standard mixes and considerably more resistant to impact loading, which was precisely why the hydraulic hammer had accomplished nothing useful at all. Every blow from the hammer had been absorbed by the grid and distributed across the full slab rather than concentrated at any single breaking point. You could not break that slab from the top. It was designed to resist exactly that. But the slab was not monolithic in the way that mattered. Earl walked the perimeter, slowly taking 45 minutes that nobody on the site had the patience to watch except Tommy Briggs. He knelt at the east edge and pressed his palm flat against the concrete surface, feeling the texture of it, the slight temperature differential between sections. He pushed a short steel rod he carried in his jacket pocket into the soil at measured intervals around the slab's edge, gauging how the resistance changed. He tapped the concrete surface at regular intervals with a short-handled hammer, listening to the note change denser here, marginally less dense there, the almost inaudible difference between sound concrete and concrete with a seam running through it. Tommy watched all of this with the careful attention of a young man who has begun to suspect that he is watching something he will be describing to other people for the rest of his career. Prentice watched with his arms crossed and one boot moving against the gravel in a slow, impatient rhythm. "What exactly is he doing?" one of the other workers asked Tommy quietly. "I think he's listening to it," Tommy said. The worker looked at him. "Listening to concrete. That's what it looks like." When Earl finished his examination, he walked back to his trailer without explaining himself and began unloading equipment. The chain was old and heavy-linked, the kind that does not stretch when loaded surplus military chain, the type that had been sold off at farm auctions across the Midwest for decades after the war. Tommy recognized the style of it. The pulley blocks were cast iron, older than anything else on the construction site, except the HD7 itself. Earl set steel stakes into the ground at measured intervals along the east side of the slab, working without hurry, without explanation, and without any apparent concern for the audience he had accumulated. Tommy walked over. "Can I ask what you're setting up?" "Chain bridle," Earl said, without stopping work. "My father rigged the first one in 1951. Had some surplus chain from a farm auction. Cost him $34 for the whole lot. This is the same chain." Tommy looked at the heavy links. "What does it do that a single chain wouldn't?" "Changes the angle of pull. Instead of pulling straight back from one point, It distributes the load across three separate attachment points along the east face of the slab. Earl drove another stake. The peak force lands right at the construction joint I found. The slab doesn't need to break. It needs to rotate east edge, up west edge, staying down, pivoting along the center axis. Once it rotates 15 degrees, the rebar bond at the construction joint releases. After that, it comes out in two sections that standard equipment can move easily. Tommy was quiet for a moment. How do you know there's a construction joint where you think there is color of the concrete, Earl said, and the crack pattern from your hammer work? Cracks follow the weak lines in a material. You just have to know what you're looking at when you read them. Prentice had drifted over during this exchange and stood at the edge of it listening with his arms no longer crossed. He said without the volume of his earlier comments, but with the same underlying certainty, that chain is 60 years old. Then. Those pulley blocks look like they came out of a barn. They did, Earl said. My rigging contractor quoted me 4-inch grade 80 chain for this job. $8,000 just for the chain. Earl looked at him briefly. Grade 80 stretches under cyclic loading. This chain doesn't. Stretch absorbs force before it reaches the material you're trying to move. He went back to setting stakes. Your rigging contractor builds for peak strength. I'm building for consistency. Those aren't the same thing. Prentice stared at him for a moment, then walked away toward his truck. Tommy heard him on the phone the words concrete saw crew and Thursday carrying clearly across the quiet of the site. The concrete saw crew was his backup, his insurance, his evidence that he was not simply going to stand here and let an old man make a fool of him in front of his workers. $28,000 for 3 days. It was already scheduled in his mind, if not yet on paper. There was also the weather. Tommy checked his phone while Prentice was on his call. Rain was forecast in 48 hours, a serious front coming down from the northwest, the kind that would turn the Iowa clay into a surface that heavy equipment could not work without making it worse. 48 hours. The concrete saw crew would need at least that much lead time to mobilize. If Earl Gunderson was going to do anything useful, it needed to start today. Let me tell you about the afternoon that followed, because that is when Earl Gunderson started the work, and when the work started going wrong before it started going right. He had the HD7 position and the bridle system fully rigged by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The setup looked to the construction workers who had gathered at a respectful distance to watch like something from a different century, the old crawler sitting low and heavy at the end of the chain system, the heavy links running through the 2 cast iron pulley blocks to 3 separate attachment points along the east face of the slab, the entire arrangement creating a web of load paths that no single piece of modern equipment would have been configured to produce. It looked improvised. It looked to anyone who did not understand what they were looking at like it was probably not going to work. Earl engaged the clutch. The HD7 steel tracks found purchase in the Iowa clay, and the chain came taut across its full length. The pulley blocks creaked under the load. The engine note deepened as the drawbar pull came on. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. For 45 seconds, nothing moved. The chain was rigid as iron bar. The slab did not shift. Then the east attachment chain slipped off its anchor point with a sound like a rifle shot, and the entire load released at once, the HD7 lurching forward 2 feet before Earl could get the clutch disengaged. He climbed down from the seat and walked around the slab in silence for several minutes, looking at the anchor point that had failed, then at the surrounding concrete, then at the soil at the slab's edge. Prentice said something from the direction of his pickup truck, but the distance swallowed it. One of the workers laughed quietly in the way workers laugh when they are trying not to be caught doing it. Earl had miscalculated the width of the east face. The slab ran 18 inches further south than he had measured from the surface expression of the concrete. The anchor point had been placed 4 inches outside the rebar grid in unreinforced concrete near the edge, and it had pulled clean. He moved the stake south. He moved the attachment point to match. He added the second pulley block that he had brought on the trailer, but not initially deployed, running the chain through it to change the load angle by 7 degrees that the geometry of the slab's construction joint required and that his first setup had missed. It cost him 40 minutes. Virgil's voice came to him, not as memory exactly, not as the specific recall of a specific moment, but as presence. The way certain voices stay with a man past the point where he can still hear them in any literal sense, still shaping the way he thinks about problems long after the person who spoke them is gone. When the chain slips, it's the ground telling you something. Don't fight it. Go back and listen. Earl went back and listened. He pressed the rod into the soil at the new anchor point and felt the resistance change denser. More uniform, the rod hitting reinforcement at the correct depth. Good bond all the way to the edge. He climbed back onto the HD7. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the engine began to knock. Not the deep, alarming knock of a bearing failing, but the lighter, higher note of a machine running hotter than it should, the note that meant stop and check before it became something worse. Earl shut it down immediately. He checked the water level, which was adequate. He pulled the magneto cover and found a faint arcing pattern on the contact points that he had not heard that morning, the early sign of a gap that had opened during the afternoon's load work and was beginning to fire inconsistently. He cleaned the points with a rag from his jacket pocket, closed the gap to spec from memory, and waited 20 minutes for the engine temperature to come down before he tried to restart. During those 20 minutes, he sat on the steel seat and drank from Ruth's thermos. The coffee was still warm. Around him, the construction site had gone quieter than it had been earlier in the day. The workers from the road grading crew had moved their operation to a different part of the property, giving the old man and his old machine whatever space the situation seemed to require. Tommy Briggs was still there, sitting on an overturned concrete block at a respectful distance, with his arms on his knees, not speaking, not looking at his phone, just watching. Prentice walked over once during the cooling period. He stood at the edge of Earl's awareness and said with something in his voice that was not quite contempt anymore, but had not yet found its way to anything else. He gets until sundown tomorrow. After that, I'm calling the saw crew Thursday morning, and we're done waiting. Earl did not respond. He finished his coffee, screwed the cap back onto the thermos, and set it in the trailer bed. Prentice walked away. Let me tell you about the last thing Virgil Gunderson ever taught his son, because Earl was thinking about it as the engine cooled and the August light moved long and golden across the Iowa clay. It was the summer of 1967, the last good summer Virgil had the year he died, though neither of them knew that in July, when the summer was still full. They had been working the HD7 together on a rock removal job in the North Field, a granite outcropping that had been sitting just below the surface since Virgil broke the ground in 1931, and that Virgil had finally decided in his last good summer to pull out entirely, rather than keep farming around it season after season. The rock had not wanted to come. They had worked at it for 3 days and gotten nowhere that mattered. On the third day, Virgil had stopped the machine and sat for a long time looking at the rock without saying anything. Then he said, "Every piece of ground has a weak point, Earl. Every rock, too. Every old concrete foundation, too, probably. Find the joint, find where it wants to separate from the thing holding it. Then you don't need strength. You need patience and the right angle. Patience and the right angle will beat strength every time if you're willing to wait for them to work." They had found the joint on the fourth day, and the granite outcropping had come out clean as a pulled tooth. Earl restarted the HD7 at 4:37. The knock was gone. The magneto was clean. Sundown tomorrow was still 22 hours away, and he had found the right angle that afternoon when the chain slipped and the ground showed him where the anchor needed to be. He engaged the clutch. The chain came taut again. The pulley blocks took the load. The HD7 leaned into the work with the particular quality that Virgil Gunderson had paid $1,100 for in 1948 and never regretted, not strength exactly, but steadiness. The continuous application of drawbar pull from the ground level up, without the surge and release of hydraulic systems, without the impact loading that reinforced concrete was specifically engineered to resist. Just a steady, patient pull, held and held and held, while the Iowa clay pushed back against the tracks in the rebar grid inside the slab, held its geometry, and the construction joint that Earl had found considered what it was being asked to do. The slab did not move. Earl held the throttle exactly where it was. The site foreman from the road grading crew had drifted back over, and 3 of Prentice's workers were standing at the edge of the work area watching. One of them said something to the others that Earl could not hear over the engine. There was laughter, not cruel laughter, the laughter of men who have decided on the available evidence that they know how something is going to end and have found a kind of relief in that certainty. Tommy Briggs did not laugh. He had not moved from his concrete block. He was watching the chain. The weather report said rain in 48 hours. The concrete saw crew was on standby in Des Moines, and Earl Gunderson sat on the steel seat of an Alice Chalmers HD7 that his father had bought in 1948 for $1,100, holding a steady throttle against a foundation slab that had been in the ground for 50 years, and he waited for it to tell him it was ready. On a Wednesday morning in August of 1994, at 6:45, Tommy Briggs turned his truck off the county road into the Clearwater Meadows access gate and heard the HD7 before he saw anything else. The sound came across the field from the northwest corner of the site, not the smooth, contained hum of the road grader or the komatsu idling, but something with more texture in it, a mechanical rhythm that had been running since before Tommy was born and had no particular interest in sounding like anything other than what it was. He parked and stepped out and felt the vibration through the soles of his boots before he had taken 3 steps. The ground was carrying it crawler tracks working steadily in the Iowa clay, the slow, reliable rotation of steel against earth. Earl Gunderson had been there since before first light. Tommy stood for a moment at the edge of the work area and looked at the old man on the old machine in the early morning quiet. The August sun was just clearing the tree line to the east, and it fell across the HD7 in the chain system and the pale gray face of the slab at a low angle that made the whole scene look like something from a different era entirely. Earl sat straight-backed on the steel seat with both hands on the controls, and his thermos on the fender beside him, and he did not look up when Tommy walked over. The chain was configured differently than it had been when Tommy had left the previous evening. He could see that immediately. The east anchor stake had been moved. The second pulley block had been repositioned at a different angle. The come-along had been deployed and was now integrated into the system in a way it had not been the afternoon before. Earl had been out here in the dark, repositioning the entire bridle system by feel and memory, and the kind of knowledge that does not require light to function, and the work had been done with the same quiet precision he applied to everything else. "You changed the setup," Tommy said. "Found a better angle," Earl said. He did not elaborate. "When did you get here? 4:30? Tommy looked at the sky. "That's 2 hours before sunrise." Earl adjusted the throttle fractionally. "I know what time sunrise is. Let me tell you about what happened in the next 4 hours, because that is the part of this story that Tommy Briggs would spend 20 years trying to describe accurately to other people and never quite managed to get exactly right. Dale Prentice arrived at 8:15 later than usual and found Tommy standing 30 feet from the slab watching the HD7 work. He walked over with his coffee and stood beside Tommy for a moment without speaking. "Anything?" Prentice said. "Not yet," Tommy said, "but watch the chain." Prentice looked at the chain. It was rigid, not taut in the way a chain goes taut when force is applied and released in cycles, but rigid in the way a steel bar is rigid when it is under sustained load, holding without variation, without the cyclic surge that had snapped his hydraulic lines and cracked his bucket teeth over the previous 11 days. The HD7's engine was running at a steady note, not laboring, not easing off, just holding. The way a man holds a door against a wind he knows will eventually stop. "He's been at it since 4:30, Tommy said. Prentice said nothing. He drank his coffee and watched. At 9:47, the ground at the east edge of the slab cracked. Not the surface concrete, the ground itself. A seam opened in the Iowa clay along the line where the slab's buried edge met the soil, running perhaps 6 feet from the northeast corner toward the center. It was a small thing, a 1/4 inch wide, maybe less in places, but it was new and it had not been there before, and Tommy saw it the moment it appeared and said nothing because he did not want to say anything until he was sure it was real. Earl saw it too. He did not change his throttle. He did not change his expression. He waited. The chain held its load. The HD7 held its throttle. The pulley blocks held their angles. At 10:12, a sound came out of the ground beneath the slab that Tommy Briggs had no frame of reference for. It was not the crack of concrete breaking under impact. It was lower than that and longer. A deep structural groan felt as much as heard transmitted through the earth itself, the sound of something that had been fixed in one position for 53 years, beginning very slowly to reconsider that position. Then the east edge of the slab moved. Not much. Half an inch, maybe a fraction less. But Tommy saw it, the pale gray edge of the concrete lifting fractionally away from the soil line, a sliver of shadow appearing beneath it where no shadow had ever been. He did not say anything. He held his breath without meaning to. The HD7 held its load, 1 inch. The shadow beneath the east edge was visible now without squinting for it, 2 inches. The construction joint that Earl had identified the previous day, the seam where two separate concrete pours had met in 1941, tied together by rebar, but bonded by chemistry that was now 73 years old, began to open. A dark line appeared along the east face of the slab running parallel to the surface, traveling across the full 40-foot width with the slow, deliberate progress of something that has been waiting for exactly the right conditions and has finally found them. 3 inches. "Oh," Tommy said. It was the only word he had. The slab was not breaking. That was the thing Tommy would spend years trying to explain to people who had not been there. It was rotating. The east edge was coming up and the west edge was staying down, pivoting along the center axis of the slab in exactly the way Earl had described standing in the work area the previous afternoon, exactly the way Virgil Gunderson had understood concrete moved when you found the right angle and applied the right force in the right direction with enough patience to let the geometry work. The rebar grid was still intact. The concrete on both sides of the joint was still intact. But the bond between the two pores at the construction joint was releasing inch by inch as the rotation put tensile stress on the one type of load that particular joint had not been designed to resist indefinitely. 4 inches? 5. The workers from the road grading crew had stopped their machines. Tommy did not know when it had happened. He had not looked away from the slab, but they were all standing at the edge of the work area now, 6 of them, and none of them were talking. 6 inches. The shadow beneath the east edge was a dark band now wide enough to see clearly from 20 feet away, without effort. Earl made one adjustment. He eased the throttle back by approximately 10%, not reducing the load, but changing the character of it, shifting from steady pull to something even more gradual, a force so continuous and so patient that the concrete had no impact event to resist, no surge to distribute across the grid, nothing to push back against. Just the persistent geometry of a load applied at the correct angle by a machine that had been designed for exactly this quality of sustained work. 8 inches. The joint line across the east face was fully open now, a dark gap running the entire 40-foot width of the slab, 2 inches wide at its widest point, the rebar visible inside it as a grid of rust-colored steel holding the two sections in relation to each other, but no longer bonding them in any meaningful way. Tommy heard Dale Prentice say something behind him. He didn't catch the words. He did not look away from the slab. 10 inches. 12. The east edge of the slab was 18 inches above the soil line and continuing to rise, pivoting on the center axis, the west edge pressing fractionally deeper into the clay as the physics demanded. The whole 40-foot width of concrete was in motion, slow, controlled, irreversible motion, separating along the joint line into two sections that were no longer one impossible problem, but two manageable ones. Then Earl stopped the HD7. He climbed down from the seat with the same deliberate pace he used for everything, walked to the trailer, and took out a second length of chain, shorter, heavier, with links the size of a man's fist. He attached it to the east section of the slab at a new angle, ran it through the come-along he had brought, but not yet used, and connected the other end to the HD7's rear drawbar. He climbed back up, engaged the clutch. The come-along took up the slack. The heavy chain went rigid. He did not pull up this time. He pulled sideways. The east section of the slab, 20 feet wide, 60 feet long, 14 inches thick, more than 50 years in the ground, rotated the last necessary degrees and then slid. It did not crack. It did not shatter. It moved laterally across the surface of the Iowa clay with a sound like the earth clearing its throat after a long silence, and it came to rest on its side at the edge of the excavated area with a single concussive impact that Tommy felt in his sternum from 30 feet away. The dust came up in a slow brown wave and drifted west on the August morning air. When it settled, the northwest corner of Clearwater Meadows had a clean foundation hole where the slab had been. The rebar grid was intact. The concrete was in two pieces, both manageable with standard equipment. The footing trench could be cut by afternoon. For 30 full seconds, nobody on the construction site made a sound. Dale Prentice stood absolutely still. His coffee cup was in his right hand at his side, and he was not aware of it. His face had gone a color that was not quite pale and not quite anything else with a name. His arms were simply at his sides. His eyes were on the open hole in the ground where an unmovable thing had been, and he was not moving. Tommy Briggs looked from Prentice to Earl and back to Prentice. The 6 workers from the grading crew looked at each other. No one spoke. Earl Gunderson began coiling chain. Dale Prentice did not move toward Earl immediately. He stood at the edge of the foundation hole for a long time longer than felt comfortable for anyone watching, with his coffee cup at his side and his eyes on the place where the slab had been. The dust from the concrete's movement was still settling in the air around him. The rebar grid was visible in the open hole, rust-colored and intact, running its 12-inch pattern across the full width of the excavation like the skeleton of something that had been waiting underground for 50 years to be seen properly. Tommy had been watching Prentice the way you watch a man when you are not entirely sure what he is going to do next. In 3 years of working for Prentice Land and Grading, Tommy had seen his employer angry, impatient, dismissive, occasionally generous in the way that men are generous when generosity costs them nothing. He had never seen him look like this, like a man who has had something taken from him, not money, not time, not the Clearwater Meadows contract, but some foundational assumption about how the world worked that he had been carrying so long he had stopped being aware of its weight. Earl had his back to all of it. He was working through the chain system methodically, unhooking each section from its anchor stakes, coiling the lengths over his arm, with the practiced economy of a man who has done this particular task several hundred times and sees no reason to do it differently today than any other day. Prentice set his coffee cup on the hood of his pickup truck and walked toward Earl. He walked without the forward lean he usually carried, without the particular energy that Dale Prentice generally used, the way other men use cologne applied heavily and detectable from a distance, intended to establish something about him before he opened his mouth. He walked the way a man walks when he is thinking carefully about what he is going to say and has not quite finished thinking. Earl heard him coming and did not turn around. "There's your foundation hole," Earl said. "I'd get your people on the footing trench before the rain hits. Forecast says tomorrow afternoon." Prentice stopped a few feet behind him. "I owe you something," he said. $8,500, Earl said. "Same number I gave you yesterday." "I mean something else." Prentice paused. It was a different kind of pause than his usual pauses, which were the pauses of a man waiting for other people to catch up to where he already was. This one was the pause of a man waiting for himself. "In May, what I said in front of the crew." He stopped again. "About the Smithsonian, about your farm." Earl finished coiling the section of chain he was working on and laid it on the trailer. He turned around then for the first time since the slab had come free and looked at Prentice directly. His expression did not have anger in it. It did not have satisfaction in it either. Not the bright kind that flares up in a man when he has been proved right and wants the other man to know it and feel it. It had something quieter than either of those things. Something that came from having lived long enough to understand that being right about a thing and being gracious about it afterward were 2 separate skills, and that the second one was harder to develop and more worth having. "You were wrong about the machine," Earl said, "and you were wrong about me, but you're not the first man who's made that mistake, and you're probably not going to be the last." Prentice looked at him. "That's more than I deserve." "Probably," Earl said without any particular edge in it, "but it's what I've got." He turned back to the trailer and picked up the second chain length. Prentice did not leave. He stood there in the morning light with his hands in his pockets watching Earl work. And after a moment he said something that Tommy Briggs, standing close enough to hear, would carry with him for the rest of his working life. "How did you know where to pull from?" "I had a structural engineer out of Ames look at that slab for 2 hours. He told me there was no accessible weak point." Earl folded the chain over his arm. "He was looking at the surface," he said. "I was listening to what was underneath." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Earl glanced at him. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not the question of a man preparing a counter-argument, not the question of a man who already knows the answer and wants to see if you do. Earl had spent his whole life asking genuine questions and had learned to recognize them when other people asked them. "Your engineer was trained to look at what concrete is," Earl said. "Composition, reinforcement, pattern, thickness. load capacity under the stresses he knew how to calculate. That's all useful information. But concrete also has a history. It was poured by somebody on a particular day in a particular sequence under particular conditions. That history is written in the material itself if you know how to read it. He set the chain on the trailer. The joint I found where two separate pours met in 1941, that's a seam. The rebar crosses it, which is why the slab stayed together under impact loading. But the concrete bond at the joint is different from the bond in the surrounding material. Different age, different chemistry, different color, if you know what to look for, different density, sound, if you know how to tap for it, different crack pattern from your hammer work, if you know what cracks are telling you. He paused. Your engineer didn't find it because he wasn't looking for a pour sequence. He was looking for a failure point under the loads he already knew how to model. Prentice was quiet for a long moment. The road grader idled 50 yards away. A crow crossed the sky above the tree line to the east. I've been building for 20 years, Prentice said finally with the particular quietness of a man who is saying something true about himself for the first time in a while. I'm not sure I've understood the why of most of what I've built. Earl looked at him steadily for a moment. That's an honest thing to say. Your machines were fighting the concrete, Prentice said slowly, like a man working something out as he speaks. You said that yesterday. You weren't fighting it. No. What were you doing finding the angle it wanted to move? Earl picked up the come-along and began winding it back to its storage length. The concrete didn't change. The slab didn't change. The problem didn't change from the first day you started working on it to this morning. Only the thinking changed. He looked up. You can't buy your way out of a geometry problem, Dale. You have to think your way out of it. Your machines were the right answer to a different question. Prentice reached into his shirt pocket and took out his checkbook. He wrote the check without asking Earl to repeat the amount, tore it out, and held it across the space between them. Earl took it, looked at it once, and put it in his shirt pocket without folding it. One more thing, Prentice said. He hesitated in the way men hesitate when they have decided to say something and are not entirely certain it will land the way they mean it. That machine of yours, the HD7. He nodded toward the crawler. My grandfather had a photograph of one in his shop when I was a boy. I always thought it was just an old photograph. Something from before. He stopped. I didn't understand what I was looking at. Earl looked at the HD7 for a moment, the faded orange, the open steel seat, the tracks worn bright at the contact points from 46 years of work. My father paid $1,100 for it in 1948, Earl said. It was the most money he ever spent on anything at one time in his life. He stood in front of it for a long time the night he brought it home. He picked up his thermos from the fender. He used to say that when you spend everything you've got on something, you ought to look at it long enough to understand what you've done. You ought to know what you're taking on. Then you go to work. He turned toward the cab. You've got a foundation hole. Go to work. He started the HD7 and drove it back toward the gate, the steel tracks marking the Iowa clay with the same steady pattern they had been marking for 46 years, the engine settling into its road rhythm as the slope eased. Tommy watched him go. When the sound of the crawler had faded enough that the road grader's idle was the loudest thing on the site again, he became aware that Prentice was standing beside him. Get the crew on that footing trench, Prentice said. His voice was back to its operational register, forward-looking, the voice of a man with a schedule to keep. But something in it had shifted. The way the note of a bell shifts when you change what it is made of. Not dramatic, noticeable if you had been listening carefully. Yes, sir, Tommy said. And Briggs. Prentice picked up his coffee cup from the hood of his truck. What he did out here this morning, do you understand how he did it? Tommy thought about it honestly. Most of it, he said. Enough to know I don't understand all of it yet. Prentice nodded. Learn the rest of it, he said. However long it takes. He walked toward his truck. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the morning of August 17th, 1994 was not an ending. It was the kind of beginning that only looks like an ending from the outside. Dale Prentice had completed Clearwater Meadows on schedule. The first 12 buyers closed their contracts in October as written. The development sold out in 14 months at prices that came in slightly above projection. Prentice called Earl the following spring with a drainage problem on a site in neighboring Franklin County that his own crew could not diagnose. Then a foundation issue in Wright County in 1997, similar in character to the Clearwater Meadows situation, but with a poured concrete wall section instead of a full slab. Then two more jobs over the following 4 years, each time with the same straightforward conversation. Prentice described the problem. Earl listened without interrupting, named his day rate, and showed up with the HD7 and the trailer of chain and pulleys, and settled things that newer equipment had not settled. The total across those 5 jobs came to $31,500 paid promptly each time without negotiation. In December of 1999, Earl Gunderson drove to the Hardin County Federal Credit Union in Eldora and made his final mortgage payment on the 280 acres that Virgil had broken from raw ground in 1931. The land was paid free and clear for the first time in 68 years. Earl deposited the paid-off receipt, walked back to his truck, and drove home on County Road E23. He stopped at the rise on the road where you could see the whole farm from the north. The house Virgil had built, the barn where the HD7 lived, the fields running south toward the timber, the whole of it, and he sat in the truck for a while with the engine off and looked at it. He had been thinking about Ruth. He thought about her most days, but on certain particular days more than others. In the fall of 1998, Tommy Briggs had given his notice at Prentice Land and Grading. He had spent the 4 years since the August morning in 1994 working to understand what he had watched, reading about soil mechanics and historical construction methods, and the physics of mechanical advantage on evenings and weekends, taking on small problem jobs in his own time to practice the techniques, calling Earl occasionally with questions that Earl answered fully and without impatience or condescension. He started Briggs Site Solutions in January of 1999. With one truck, a used crawler he bought at auction for $6,000 in a chain and pulley system. He built himself according to specifications Earl had walked him through over 2 long afternoons in the Gunderson barn. The company's first job was a foundation removal problem in Hamilton County that 3 other contractors had declined to take. Tommy completed it in a day and a half. By 2008, Briggs Site Solutions had 11 employees, a fleet of 4 machines, and a reputation across 6 Midwestern states as the company you called when the standard approach had already failed and you were running out of other options. Tommy credited Earl Gunderson in every professional conversation where the subject of the company's methods came up. Not because he felt obligated to, but because it was accurate, and Tommy Briggs was constitutionally unable to be inaccurate about where he had learned something important. Dale Prentice sold Prentice Land and Grading to a Chicago-based development firm in October of 2001. He was 51 years old and took a fair price and retired to a house on a lake in Emmett County in northern Iowa. He fished in the mornings. He read in the afternoons. He called his son Ryan on Sundays. He had kept one thing from his years in the business without quite deciding to keep it, a photograph that Tommy had taken accidentally on a disposable camera on the morning of August 17, 1994, while documenting site conditions for the insurance file. Tommy had framed the shot without realizing what he was framing until he saw the developed prints 2 weeks later. It showed the HD7 from the southeast chain system fully rigged, the east edge of the slab already 8 inches above the soil line, and Earl Gunderson on the steel seat with both hands on the controls and his back straight in the low morning sun behind him. The focus was slightly off. The exposure was a little hot on the left side. It was the best photograph Tommy Briggs had ever accidentally taken. He made 2 prints, one for himself and one at his own initiative, without being asked for Dale Prentice. Prentice had it framed in a plain wooden frame and hung it in the study of the lake house. When guests asked about it, he told them the whole story. He always told the part about May, where he had told an old farmer to stay out of the way and watch how it was done. He told that part every time because he had come to believe it was the most important part of the story. "Why do you keep telling it if it makes you look bad?" his son Ryan had asked once when Ryan was in high school, and still found embarrassment a useful concept. "Because the lesson lives in that part," Prentice said. "The concrete is just the setup. Let me tell you about the cost comparison because the numbers are worth understanding." The HD7 had been purchased in 1948 for $1,100. Maintenance costs across 60 years of continuous operation averaged approximately $200 per year. Some years, nothing at all. Some years more, but averaging out to a modest and predictable number. Total investment across 6 decades, including the original purchase, roughly $13,000. Against that, the Komatsu PC400 that Prentice had financed at $385,000 had been replaced by a newer model in 2000 at $410,000. Finance charges alone on those two machines across their respective loan terms exceeded $60,000. The HD7 had outlasted both of them and was still in the Gunderson barn in Hardin County. Earl Gunderson spent the years after 1994 the same way he had spent the years before, working his 280 acres through the seasons, maintaining the HD7 on the schedule Virgil had established in 1948, and that had not varied since watching the land around him change as the development pressure that had brought Dale Prentice to Hardin County continued to move across rural Iowa. Farmland in Hardin County that had sold for $1,800 an acre in 1994 was selling for $4,000 by 2002 and $6,000 by 2006. The same forces were still working. The same mechanism was still operating. And the same old machine was still in the same old barn, started every month, maintained every season, waiting with the particular patience of iron and steel for the next time someone needed it. In the spring of 2006, Gary had a conversation with his father about the HD7 that neither of them had known was coming. They were in the barn doing the season's first service on the machine, and Earl was on the ground checking the track tension, which involved getting down on one knee and staying there. And Gary watched his father get back up and registered something in the effort that he had not registered before. Not weakness exactly, something that preceded weakness. "Dad," Gary said. "I know," Earl said. "I'm not saying you can't still operate it. I know what you're saying." They worked in silence for a while. Then Earl said, "Show me, the magneto points adjustment, both the summer and winter settings." Gary showed him, "Show me how you'd read a pour joint in concrete you haven't seen before." Gary described the method, color variation, crack pattern, the rod test for density difference, and the chain bridle angle calculation. Gary worked through it. Earl listened, corrected one detail about the pivot geometry that Gary had approximated rather than calculated precisely, and then stood up from where he had been sitting on an overturned bucket. "All right," Earl said. It was everything he needed to say. He did not operate the HD7 after that spring, except once in the fall of 2007, when a drainage problem in the North Field required a precision of grade work that Gary felt better having his father handle. Earl drove the machine for 40 minutes, completed the grade, and parked it back in the barn. He said nothing about it being the last time. He did not know it was the last time. Earl Gunderson died on the 14th of March, 2008, at 88 years old in the house that Virgil had built in Elliott Township. He died in the bedroom where he had slept for most of his life on a night in early spring when the fields outside still carried the last of the winter frost and would be ready to work in another 6 weeks. He had gone to bed at his usual hour and not woken up, which was the manner of death that suited him in the way that certain things suit certain people quietly at home without theater. Gary drove the HD7 to the Lutheran Church in Eldora on the morning of the funeral. He backed it off the trailer in the church parking lot before sunrise and parked it where people would see it when they came in. He had not asked anyone's permission. He had simply thought his father would have wanted the machine there. And he had been right, because 180 people came to that service, and a considerable number of them stopped on the way in to put a hand on the old crawler's fender in the way people touch things that have meant something to them. Tommy Briggs flew in from Des Moines. Dale Prentice drove down from Emmett County and sat in the third pew. After the service in the parking lot, Prentice found Gary and shook his hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake strictly requires. "Your father was the best man I've ever met on a job site," Prentice said. "It took me about 15 years to fully understand what he did that morning in '94. I hope he knew I understood it eventually." He knew, Gary said. It was true. Earl had known in the way certain people know things that have not been said in words, through the quality of attention that other people pay you when they have learned something from you and are still working with it. Tommy's questions over the years. The 5 jobs Prentice had called him back for. The check written without negotiation on the morning of August 17, 1994. These were not words, but they were a language, and Earl Gunderson had been listening carefully his whole life. Let me tell you about the spring of 2019, because certain lessons do not complete themselves in a single generation. Gary Gunderson was 54 years old when his phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in April. The caller introduced himself as Ryan Prentice, 31 years old, said he was working a residential development in Grundy County, about 40 miles south of Hardin County, and said he had gotten Gary's number from Tommy Briggs, who had told him simply, if you have a foundation problem and conventional equipment has already failed, call this man. Ryan Prentice had a 1930s concrete slab under the path of his main entrance road. His excavator had been at it for 4 days. 2 broken bucket pins, 1 cracked hydraulic cylinder, $12,000 in repairs and delays, and the slab had not moved. Gary asked 3 questions: the approximate dimensions of the slab, whether the surface showed any color variation at the edges, and what direction the excavator had been pulling from. South and west, Ryan said. You've been pulling from the wrong side, Gary said. What time do you want me there tomorrow? He loaded the HD7 onto the flatbed that evening. The machine was 71 years old. Gary had been starting it on the first of every month since his father had handed it to him, running it for 20 minutes to keep the systems moving, checking the magneto and the track tension and the throttle linkage on the schedule Virgil had established in 1948, and that had not varied in 70 years. The crawler sounded the same as it had always sounded. Ryan Prentice was standing by his truck when the trailer came through the Grundy County gate the next morning. He watched Gary back the HD7 off the ramp. He looked at the machine for a long moment, the age of it, the faded orange paint, the open steel seat, the tracks worn smooth and bright at the contact points from 7 decades of continuous use. That's the machine my father told me about, Ryan said. What did he tell you? Ryan considered. He said a farmer in Hardin County did something with it that he still couldn't entirely explain 30 years later. He said it changed the way he thought about problems. He paused. He has a photograph of it in his study. I grew up looking at that photograph without knowing the story behind it. Gary finished checking the ramp chains. Call him, he said. Put him on speaker. Ryan called. Dale Prentice answered on the second ring, and his voice came through the phone speaker across 25 years and 40 miles, with the same certainty it had always carried, but with something underneath it now that had not been there in 1994. A weight that was not heaviness exactly. The weight of a man who has arrived at his convictions through experience rather than assumption and knows the difference. Ryan tells me you have an HD7 running in the background, Dale said. Warming up, Gary said. A pause long enough that Gary could hear wind through the speaker. Watch everything he does, Dale said to Ryan. You don't look at your phone. You don't take a call. You watch every single thing he does from start to finish. You understand me? Yes, Dad. And when he's done, you shake his hand properly and you pay him whatever he asks without any argument at all. You hear me? Yes, Dad. And Gary. Another pause. Whatever your father passed down about that morning, I'm glad it's still running. Gary pulled the Grundy County slab in 2 hours and 43 minutes. Ryan Prentice watched every minute of it. When the concrete came free and settled on its side at the edge of the excavation, and the dust moved across the April morning, Ryan stood in the same silence that his father had stood in a quarter-century before, in 4 counties to the north, looking at a clean hole in the earth where something unmovable had been. Gary was halfway through coiling chain when Ryan walked over. How, Ryan said, the same word his father had used, the same word probably that men would keep using as long as there were problems that looked like strength problems, but were actually thinking problems, and as long as there were people willing to look long enough at the ground to understand what it was trying to say. Your machines were fighting it, Gary said. I wasn't fighting anything. He set a length of chain on the trailer. You find the angle the problem wants to move. You apply patient force. You don't stop before it's ready. He looked at Ryan. My grandfather taught my father that. My father taught me. Your father could tell you the same thing in his own words if you asked him the right question. Ryan Prentice wrote a check for $8,500. Gary had named the same number his father had charged in 1994, and Ryan had not questioned it. He handed it over, and Gary put it in his shirt pocket. On the drive back to Hardin County, Gary called his daughter Leanne, who was 19, and in her second year at Iowa State, studying agricultural engineering. He told her about the morning, the slab, the chain bridle, the angle, the 2 hours and 43 minutes. She listened without interrupting. Same principle as last summer, she said when he finished. The limestone outcropping in the East Field. Same principle, Gary said. Great-granddad figured that out before there was a name for it. He figured out most things before there was a name for them, Gary said. That was just who he was. The HD7 is in the Gunderson barn in Elliott Township, Hardin County, Iowa. Gary starts it on the first of every month, regardless of weather or season, to keep the systems moving the way they were built to move. Leanne has been operating it since she was 15, and she has the quality that Virgil had, and Earl had, and Gary has the willingness to look at a problem for a long time before deciding she understands it, the patience to listen before she asks anything to move. The machine is 76 years old. It will probably outlast the people who are currently worried about it. It was built to do exactly that. Let me tell you the last thing, because this story has been carrying it from the first sentence underneath all the chain and the concrete and the particular sound a crawler tractor makes in August on Iowa clay. In Hardin County today, farmland sells for $8,000 to $10,000 an acre. Young farmers face the same debt arithmetic that faced their grandfathers in 1981, with different numbers attached to the same underlying mechanism. Borrow more than you can comfortably service. Hope the market validates your assumptions. If it doesn't discover that the bank's patience has a specific and non-negotiable endpoint, the current model combined that a farm family finances today will cost close to $500,000. The finance charges on that machine across a 7-year loan at current rates will exceed what Earl Gunderson paid for 50 years of maintenance on the HD7. Many of those new machines will be obsolete before they are paid for. The HD7 has never been obsolete because it was not built for a market cycle. It was built for work, and work does not go out of fashion. Virgil Gunderson understood this in 1948 when he stood in front of the machine he had spent everything to buy and looked at it long enough to understand what he had done. Earl understood it for 50 years of farming. Gary understands it now. Leanne is learning it. The lesson is not about tractors. New does not mean smarter. Expensive does not mean better. A machine you understand completely, its history, its weaknesses, its particular quality of work is worth more than a machine that costs 10 times as much and that owns you in ways you haven't finished calculating yet. And the man everyone told to turn around and go home, the man who showed up anyway with his father's chain and his grandfather's patience, and 70 years of listening carefully to what the ground was trying to say, that man is sometimes the only one on the site who knows how the problem actually wants to be solved. In Hardin County, Iowa, there is always more ground to listen to. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me what is the oldest piece of equipment you have ever seen outwork something brand new. Or tell me about the quiet person in your life who knew something the loud ones had missed entirely. And if you want more stories about the people who built this country by thinking carefully and working patiently and refusing to stop before the job was done, subscribe. There are more of those stories than most people realize, and every one of them is worth knowing.